Hello, everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel. And today we are continuing our KINKFEST interview series. And today we are going to be speaking with Mina Hart. Mina, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah, hi, I'm Mina Hart. I am really excited to be talking to Evie. Let's see, I'm always really bad at talking about myself. Let's see, I've been in the BDSM community since 2006. I'm a switch, and I do lots and lots of kinky things. I don't know how much you wanted me to go into my history and everything.
Oh, yeah. I'm always really curious about that, like how you actually got started in the BDSM community. Like, what sort of organizations do you associate yourself with? Like, are you a leather person? Are you more of a general BDSM person? Like, what was your gateway into the BDSM world?
So my gateway, because I am over 40, was in the age of not great internet. My intro was actually alt.com, and I started on Adult Friend Finder because I really thought that I was just weird and that there was nobody else like me because there wasn't a great internet to find other people. And I was on Adult Friend Finder, and it was mostly swingers, and I knew that it was a little closer to what I was looking for, but not quite what I was looking for. And I saw a little thing in the bottom that said alt.com. And so I asked the people in the chat room I was in what alt.com was. And they said, don't go over there. They want to tie you up and spank you and stuff. And so I was pleasantly surprised and pretty excited. And I, in the chat room, was like, oh no, that I definitely won't go over there, as I was signing up to go over to alt.com. And then I realized that there were a lot of people like me. And they were really excited to talk to me and welcome me into the. And my first scene ever that I did was at one of our local dungeons with someone. I knew I liked whips, or at least I thought I did. And so I was specifically searching for someone that would do whips and asked everyone who the best was, and they all gave me the same. And so I contacted him and said, hey, I've never done anything with anyone, but I would like whips. And so he talked to me for a long time to make sure that I really knew what I was asking for. And I absolutely did. I knew I was a masochist. Knew that somewhere I knew that whips were what I wanted to do. And so we talked a lot over the messenger video chat. We met. My very first scene was on my birthday.
Aw, happy birthday, Scene. That's so sweet.
At a local dungeon. And he tore me up, and I hit such a blissful state so fast that I had no idea how torn up I was. And when he called the scene, I asked him why he was stopping. He's like, well, there's nowhere left to hit. I specifically remember, because it's burned into my memory, I was wearing a white shirt, cute little Girl Scout outfit. I was wearing a white shirt, and I put the shirt on, and the blood seeped through the back of my shirt. And I saved it for a really long time as a memento. And that was it. I was hooked from then on.
Wow. Yeah, that is quite the first introduction to BDSM. And I'm assuming a love for whips continued from that point on.
It did. I still love whips to this day. But now I top and bottom for them. But I was strictly a bottom at that point in my life.
Mm-hmm. So when did you discover you were a switch?
That's actually a really funny story. A friend of mine owns a house of domination and runs her own dungeon, who I now work for. But I was strictly a bottom, had no desire to top. She had a client who wanted a tickle session, and she couldn't find anyone to top for a tickle session. And we were talking, and she's like, well, do you think you would be interested? And I said, well, it's just tickle. Like, that's fun. And she still tells this story that she was listening. She heard this evil laugh come out of me. And she said that she knows at that moment that a switch was born. And afterwards, she said, see, I told you that you would really like topping. And I said, but I was just having fun. Like, I wasn't really being like a dominant. I was just having fun. And she looked at me and said, what do you think I have been doing for 20 years?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
And that's when I realized that it's all fun. And why we shouldn't be doing it if we're not having fun. And so that kind of changed my whole outlook on the top bottom switch dynamic.
A tickling scene, that is something that I know a lot of people are into. It's definitely a very niche thing, but having trouble finding somebody to do that, so interesting.
Right.
Well, yeah, so I know something else that you mentioned, for people who are listening, this is something we talked about before we started recording, but I know you had also mentioned that you also worked with a submissive mentor program. Would you mind talking about that a little bit?
I did. It was one of the pilot programs in Colorado. There was a dominant mentors program and a submissive mentors program. And I think that we all learned a lot from it. I was involved in the very first year, and they went around to established submissives in the community and asked them to mentor newer submissives or people that felt like they could gain something from a mentorship program. And so they had an equal number of mentors versus mentees, and then they rotated them around. So I would spend 1 month with each person in the program. And it was a really good experience. I think I learned a lot from it. Hopefully they learned a lot from it. But it was a really good experience for me. And there were good and bad things. But like I said, it was the first year. Like, if I were doing it again, I learned a lot and could see some changes that could happen and saw some really good outcomes. So I think, like anything, it had a mixed bag. But for me, it was a really good experience.
Yeah, I know mentorship is one of the big things that I get asked about a lot, like especially people who are like brand new to the concept of BDSM are like, "Oh my gosh, where can I find someone to teach me about this? How can I make sure I'm like learning the right thing, you know?" And so mentorship I think is a really appealing idea because of that. And sometimes that leads people more in the direction of like finding one person to teach them everything. And I really like the idea of rather than having it just be like one person who tells you, their way of doing things, you have sort of that rotation where you're getting a lot of different experiences because maybe you meet up with somebody that like completely changes the way you think about something or introduces you to a way of doing BDSM that you wouldn't have thought of on your own. And I definitely like the concept of that, but I know finding any sort of program like that, it's not like we have like a template we can use from like the vanilla world to figure out how to make it work. So definitely there's always going to be room for improvement, but I really like the concept of that.
Yeah, I'm really outspoken about there not being all the classes that I teach and everything. I talk about how this is just the way I do it, and that is subject to change at any point in time. Because if we're not learning, then we're stagnant. And I really, really dislike the one true way isms and really try to do everything I can to make sure that's not happening in my life. So I really liked that concept of rotating through and getting 12 different viewpoints in a year.
This actually reminds me, I know mentorship is a really big thing in the leather community. And one of the things that we wanted to discuss today was actually talking about the history and legacy of Leatherwomen specifically, which I think is a really interesting area to go into. So I guess before we get into, diving into the history, what's your relationship with the leather community?
I am a part of the leather community. I've been a part of a couple of different cities through a leather academy called Leather Quest that I really gained a great deal from. And I always like to tell people it's not for everybody. This is the path I chose. But if it doesn't resonate with you, by all means, don't force yourself into it. Because I have watched people go through this, well, I must not belong here, or I must not be a leather person. This way doesn't work for me. And I really, it breaks my heart to see people try to force themselves into boxes. We're sexual outlaws for a reason, and we don't belong in boxes. We've broken out of boxes. I don't understand why we're trying to put ourselves back into them. So I get pretty adamant when people talk about their concept of leather and how it resonates with them, and being supportive of it, however it manifests within them.
And I know that's, again, one of the questions I get asked a lot is, what does leather actually mean? How do you become a leather person? And I think there is definitely a connotation that people have that, like, leather is that kind of one true way thing where there's like the rules and the structure, and it has a very specific tradition to it, and it's the only way it's ever going to be. But my understanding is there is a lot of variability to it, or at least there can be. And it sounds like that's also been your experience too.
Yes, there is a lot of variability. And I think a part of a journey of identifying as leather is, I'm using all the buzzwords, journey, path, manifestation. I always laugh at myself for sounding like the one true waysms. I think it's really important that people realize that we've all arrived here through different ways, and that we all have massively different backgrounds and upbringings and experiences, and we're not all going to arrive at the same place in the same way. And that just, like, when you look at the huge array of people that our community has, it's really unreasonable to expect that all of these hugely different backgrounds of people would arrive at the same conclusion. That just doesn't make any sense to me. And so when we talk about the leather community, there's a lot of different histories of different countries that came together and kind of intermixed with each other. I like to talk about it kind of the same way English language happened. Little bits and pieces were borrowed from various places. And when you travel to different countries, or you look at the background from other countries, it all kind of shakes down to the same basic concepts, but it evinces itself in different ways. And I think that that's what makes our community so amazing and magical, is that we are all not the same, and we didn't get here for the same, through the same pathways.
No, absolutely. I'm curious. You said multiple countries kind of coming together, and whenever I've had conversations about this with people in the past, it's really, really been focused on the American aspect of leather. So, would you mind maybe talking a little bit more about what you mean by like the different countries and everything kind of contributing to what leather is?
In looking at the history of Leatherwomen, I realized how many different countries were doing things all at the same time. The Leather Dykes of London have a little movie and video, and there's German groups and Belgian, and let's see, I'm looking for my list of, I have a whole slide of leather groups around the world, and specifically women's leather groups around the world, because that's my main focus. But we do tend to focus on Americans, and we do tend to focus on men. So I wanted to branch out from that, because obviously Americans weren't the only ones rebelling.
Yeah, because the typical story you hear about the origin of the leather community is, oh, the men coming back from war got left off of these ports of call in New York and San Francisco, and they couldn't go back to their families, and so they formed their own communities, and then eventually that coalesced into leather culture. And it certainly leaves a lot of other people and a lot of other countries out of that story.
That is part of the origin story of leather in the US. And I honestly don't know much about men's leather outside of the US, but I do, I have found films and things on YouTube about the Rebel Dykes of London are especially fun. because they have a little short video that they put out, and they have all these photographs of them rebelling in public and how they lived, and that they were basically living in communal families, chosen families, because they were ostracized from their own. And I think it's really fascinating and important to remember that that Americans aren't the center of the universe. And especially American men aren't the center of the universe. There's a lot of things that happened outside of that very narrow view.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess focusing on Leatherwomen, what would you say is the origin of leather culture for women as opposed to kind of, again, that more stereotypical story we hear about the origin for men?
Like modern leather history, we talk about Cynthia Slater and how she was playing with the men, and she is a really important part of the story about leather women. But there were a whole lot of women doing things and wearing leather and being sexual outlaws and raising hell. It was the women that were taking care of the men during the AIDS crisis, and the women have been involved in leather history since the beginning. And it's kind of when I started looking further back, like, is this really when leather happened? Did it start with the men in World War II? I guess that's when we started calling it leather, but there were people that were doing the same things before then. So it's a little fuzzy on exactly when leather started, because the names were just not the same. And of course, it's harder and harder to find information before the age of the internet. It's really interesting to see women doing things and rebelling against societal norms long before World War II. So I've really debated on where to start calling it leather. Was it when the term leather for an identity came into being, or was it when they were doing things that exhibited the tenets that we have in the leather community? It's kind of debatable, but since I generally teach the class, I have a really loose definition. I started teaching women's leather history because I went to a presentation of a group that was teaching a class on leather history for a class that they were taking. And they talked a lot about the men, a lot about the men. And then they got to the end and they said, we couldn't really find much on the women, but here's the little bit that we had. And so me being curious, I was like, okay, so I'm trying to give them the benefit of the doubt. Is it that there isn't that much available, or did they not try hard enough, or did they not know what to look for? Because obviously women have been around since men have been around. I know that we're not all like proper housewives sitting at home just waiting for that moment of rebellion. So women have been rebelling since time began. So there had to be more stories out there about women. I found out that it's just harder to access, and that until you know what to look for, you're not going to find it. And then once you start getting a few names and then knowing what to look for and using those names to look for other names, there's a ton of history that's actually hard to narrow down into a class size or format. But it's actually a lot harder to find the history of women as opposed to the men. So I think that's really important to remedy because there are so many incredible women that have done so many incredible things. And a lot of them I have found on Facebook and had little fangirl moments when they answered me.
Oh, absolutely. Like it is something I think is really interesting, but it is hard to find information on specifically women. Like, I've gone and I've seen like the leather archives. I've seen all of the photographs from the various like first leather titles and like posters and, pages from magazine advertisements, back in the day before there was even alt.com, it was something where I just remember there being a lot of men and not really a lot of like photographs or things of the women. And I wonder if it's a difference in approach. Like, I know, especially with what I've heard about the women's aspect of leather culture, this is, I think, even more of an emphasis on like the rebellion aspect and not being accepted, especially, within the lesbian aspect of the women's leather community. Like, you're not even accepted by other lesbians because of like how much you're going against
Right.
their grain, let alone dominant vanilla societies. And so I'm wondering if was there like a need for more secrecy? Was it just that people didn't record things as much? Like, do you know why it was so hard to find information?
Yeah, there absolutely was a need for secrecy. And there was a huge rift between the BDSM lesbians, the lesbians, and the straight women. And the BDSM lesbians were just basically doing their thing. And the lesbians that weren't into BDSM believed that the lesbian BDSM, or the BDSM lesbians, were making them look bad because it was abusive. A lot of them had trauma with men and abuse and couldn't understand why women would perpetrate that abuse on other women when they were trying to escape that from men. And then there was a whole a whole group of straight women that were protesting everybody. And so the BDSM lesbians basically were in this tiny little circle where they were just trying to live their lives and do what they wanted to do. And they had to defend themselves on all fronts from everyone. One of my absolute heroes, Vi Johnson, I found a little video clip of her talking about how her first foray into a porn shop and buying her first porn mag, how terrifying it was to walk into a place because women didn't belong in those places anyway at that time. It was really shameful, especially for women, and especially for women to be buying things like that and participating in that kind of culture was even more looked down on than men doing it. And so she is really funny when she's talking about the story of running in and just grabbing something and running back out because it was so shameful to be in a place like that or in buying something like that. And her talking about how, because Vi Johnson created the Johnson Carter Memorial Library, and how amazing it was to be able to keep the books, because there was a time when you shouldn't be caught with those things. And the consequences were pretty extreme to be caught with anything or to be caught dressed as a man. Her talking about how incredible it was that she got to not only keep the books, but actually build a library with a brick and mortar location that people knew about. And how incredible that was to be able to do something, how far we've come. But it was absolutely more difficult for women to be out, being seen as something other than the perfect housewives that they were supposed to be by society standards. Women didn't face like the physical abuse as much in public, but they also weren't out as much in public as the men were. The men were very visible and faced a lot of physical violence. And women did absolutely face physical violence, but it wasn't as documented or pointed because women have always had physical connected relationships. And so it didn't seem as strange to see women together that were close as it does seeing men close. And so the societal standards on how that progressed and the societal repercussions for each individual group is really interesting to look at as well.
I know one of the things I'm interested about is the connection between the men's community and the women's community, especially considering how isolated, BDSM lesbians were from seemingly everybody else that you think would be their allies. Was it something where there was contention between the two? Were they just like completely separate? Did they work together, or was it something that, evolved over time?
From my research, it really seems that it became more integrated during the AIDS crisis. There were, like, nobody would take care of the victims of, they didn't know how it was transmitted. All they knew, well, and I'm using "new" in quotes, all they knew was that it was transmitted from gay man to gay man, and that's all anybody knew about it. And so they would call it the gay cancer because nobody had any idea. Was it airborne? Was it a plague from God? And finally, they figured out how the HIV virus was transmitted. But there were men languishing in hospital rooms or at home that had absolutely no one to take care of them. And it was a death sentence. And they couldn't get nurses to come in. Their families had disowned them. And so it was the lesbians that went and took care of the gay men and brought them food and bathed them and made sure they didn't die alone. Until you start looking at the numbers and hearing the stories of the men who died and how you would see somebody one week and they'd be gone the next. And there's a reason people refer to it as a plague, because it just wiped out an entire generation. From what I can tell from my research, because it did wipe out a lot of a generation, the stories aren't as available as they would have been had so many people not died. That's really when the two communities started to mesh together as a cohesive unit.
Yeah, I know that's something I've definitely heard before is, the AIDS crisis, for as horrible as it was something that did really bring the leather community together. And I think that's something that's so interesting to see how that's kind of played out into modern history in terms of like how people, for example, think, BDSM shouldn't be at like public gay pride parades, for example, despite the role that it played or that, leather people
Right.
played, in combating and taking care of people suffering from AIDS.
Right. Well, and it was leather people who were on the front lines fighting for sexual freedom and still are fighting for sexual freedom and ensuring that people can get married and that they have rights and that there's recourse for violence against gay people. And so when I hear the argument that leather people don't belong at Pride, it's all intertwined and it's all a part of the history. People lose their history over time and they forget and they get complacent because it's a terrible, like, we don't want to remember. We don't want to remember all of the horrible things and the attacks and the violence that occurred. It's not a pleasant memory. So I understand, but it is all intertwined.
Going back to kind of the core of the women's leather community, what would you say actually started to get it to coalesce into a community as opposed to, just, independent, smaller groups of people, kind of doing their own thing or something within just one city, that's happening? What actually made it kind of more interconnected, not necessarily global, but just something that actually, had some kind of definition to it?
I think it's a need of people in general to be around other people like them. And so once people start realizing that there were other people like, they wanted to be around more people like them. And people started to gather and they started to support each other and wanting to just be, not have to explain yourself or guard yourself against saying the wrong thing. The leather community is still pocketed. There are different groups who have slightly different tenets that they adhere to, and they'll condense into their smaller groups and then they'll gather in larger groups. And so the term leather community is kind of an umbrella term. It doesn't necessarily mean that they all think the same way, It's that they've decided within themselves the word leather resonates with who they are. And it's kind of, I've been asked a lot about the definition of leather, and I've come up with a lot of various ways and various things to describe a leather person. But the basic principles of leather are honor, integrity, and a moral code that you yourself choose to live by, whether anyone's looking or not. And that just boils it down to the basic principles. And then you find other people that can agree that honor and integrity are good rules to live by, and they feel like that title resonates within them, and you just find each other. And I know that that's kind of a loose, not great definition, but it's kind of how leather happened in the first place. It wasn't that organized, and it didn't have that many rules. And it's basically, if you feel like you belong there, then you do.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's something where it would be nice if we had a really concrete answer of like this exact thing happened at this day that made this thing happen, and that's how we have this, and it's all this very like neat package, right? But like that's not how history always works, you know. We don't always get that kind of solid concrete, you know, everything's uniform across the board kind of thing.
Right, and we're sexual outlaws. Everything we did, and some of what we still do, is illegal depending on where you live. And so it isn't neatly packaged, and it isn't in a nice, tidy little box that you can hand to people by design, because it could get you killed or arrested or kicked out of your family or whatever the case may be. And it's not neatly packaged in a little box by design.
That brings me to the next aspect of leather I wanted to talk about, which is the evolution of it over time, like especially considering where it started from when it was like really, really, if you get caught doing this, it's not going to end well for you. Um, how would you say the leather community for women has changed since it first got formed?
Well, let's see. Women are still doing their own thing. We're still fighting for a place. Still fighting for the ability to be able to hold our own spaces. And it's always been a fight. And I'm really happy to see more women's groups popping up and more women saying, you can't tell us what to do. We are who we are, and we don't care what you say. And it's really fascinating to see that progression, because even in the leather community, as evinced by women's leather history being difficult to access, women have always been placed on the back burner and not talked about as much, and not been always treated as lesser or not as important or influential or whatever the case may be. And there are more and more women who are living out loud and owning their power, and it's absolutely magical to see, and being a lot more. I think the internet has helped a lot with that, being a lot more out front and forward and in the public eye, and not having to be afraid about what people will say or do. I think the internet, people complain that the internet has watered down the community, and I really think that it has done an amazing amount for our community. It's made information more accessible. It's made connecting with other groups more accessible. And yes, it has brought in 50 Shades crowd, which is the major complaint that I hear. Some of those 50 Shades people really belong in the community, and we're just searching for something, anything, like one little strand to follow. And so I think it has done an amazing amount to bring, especially women, more to the front. I'm really excited to see the women of color, especially, who have been placed on the back burner and overlooked, being more spotlighted and showing the amazing things that they have done.
We have a little bit of time left, and I kind of want to pivot so we can cover one other subject that I also wanted to cover, which is religion play, religious play. I'm not sure exactly what terminology you use for it, but we've talked about it a little bit on actually another interview that I did with Lee Harrington. It was one of the first ones I ever did, and that was more about personal religion in BDSM, not really necessarily as like a play aspect, but more kind of spirituality and kink, I suppose. And from my understanding, you have more experience playing with like religious aspects as like a role play scenario or as a form of play itself at BDSM. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. I come from a very religious background, and I've noticed that a lot of people come from a religious background. Um, Catholics produce some really awesome kinksters, I've noticed. Um, a lot of us have found some trauma in our religious backgrounds. I know that the oppression that I found in my particular religious upbringing did cause some trauma for me, to where I was vehemently anti-religious for a really long time. Like, if anybody even mentioned the word God, I became very defensive and angry. And over time, I've realized that you can create what that means to yourself. And Deborah Addington was actually instrumental in this because I was at a class and Deborah Addington noticed that I bristled at the word God and became like really defensive and angry and was just bracing for somebody to try to convert me. They mentioned that you create what God is for yourself, and that they weren't going to try to convert me, and that I could calm down and relax a little. And that kind of set me on the road to playing with religion and kind of taking it back for myself. And a lot of what I do is sacrilegious, and I find that fun and healing for myself. I'm not against anyone else's religion, and I try to make a statement before my classes. If you need to debrief with me after, we can do that. But I do make fun of religions and play with them and use them to something I find more palatable to myself. And it's hard to come across as not being completely anti-religion, but I've really grown a lot past being anti-religion. I think that it can do a lot of good for people. I just realized that it's pushing of people's religion on other people that I have trouble. And so I like to play with Catholic nun trope and the schoolgirl. I like to make people say the prayers that are on the Jesus candles in the grocery store. And I'm very much an atheist, but I also respect people's individual gods and whatever they find necessary in their own version of God. I support. I just like to play with my own versions. I remember the last conference that I taught religious play at. It was 9 o'clock in the morning, and I'm walking through the hotel dressed as a nun. And it was a really fun experience to walk through a bunch of leather people who hadn't had their coffee yet, dressed as a nun. And so I kind of started the class before I started the class. But it was really interesting to be separated a little bit just by what I was wearing and have people responding to me differently by what I was wearing. And I think that sometimes it's really healing to be able to take things that would be sacrilegious and recreate them into something that you can find fun or healing or playful or whatever the outcome that you want is. And I like to support people playing with those aspects of their, because a lot of times it is really traumatic.
I think there's more of an element of comfort with kind of playing with something you're already familiar with that's part of kind of your own origin story. But what about playing with religions that you weren't born into? Like, let's say you want to do religion inspired scene that's like focused around like Wiccan ritual, even though you don't practice or aren't familiar at all with Wicca. What would you say about something like that?
I think part of the reason religious play has such an impact is because people have personally experienced those things. I wasn't raised Mormon, but I did a religious play scene with somebody who was raised Mormon, and it was very, very intense for both of us because of their experience. And I think not having that background, it's hard for me to conceptualize how that would be powerful. I mean, I guess it could be a role play. Like, I've never been a doctor, but I can do doctor nurse role play. But I just don't think it has the same deep connective without actually having had some background in it.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair enough. I was more just curious because I think that's one of the areas in particular that can be kind of squicky for people, for lack of a better term, is when you start kind of using it as a way to go outside of your own experience. And it sounds like for you, because the motivation for religion based play is so based on kind of the healing aspect of it, it wouldn't necessarily make sense to go out and use it as a way to explore other religions, because if it's not something that you or your partner's gone through, then there's not really that same kind of connection.
Right. It would definitely feel a little more squicky, and I wouldn't know like where the hot buttons in that are, not having had any background experience in that. And so, first of all, not it being not as impactful by not having those hot buttons, and possibly really causing some harm to someone else by not knowing where those hot buttons are, and just treating something that they feel is sacred as just a fun toy without having any actual knowledge in it. Doesn't feel good to me.
Yeah, you want to make sure when you're playing with stuff like this, you are staying respectful to the people for whom it is a part of their lives. And I think you kind of got into that a little bit with the fact you are actually an atheist, and it can be hard to toe that line where you do get to engage in this thing that is meaningful for you in its own way, but can also be upsetting for people that are still like actively practicing that religion.
Right. Yeah, it is. And things come up for people that they didn't know were actual triggers for them or hot buttons. Some people really hate the word trigger because it's been overused so much. But so I like to say hot buttons. But people will snap back to a moment in their childhood where they were sitting in church, and then they realize that something I just said hit some hot button for them. And so I try to make myself available to debrief with people if they feel they need it. Or they can yell at me, that's fine too. I know that I play with a lot of things that people have very intense reactions to. I'm totally fine with them needing to vent that if that's something that I've been teaching at a conference.
Yeah, so I'm wondering, when it comes to religious play, would this be something that you consider edge play? Is this something you would recommend that a new person do, or does it depend on how you choose to engage in it?
It can absolutely be emotional edge play. Like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people have a lot of trauma based in and however it evinced itself in their younger lives. And if you know that you've had that background and that there's possibly some trauma there, then I always recommend people have a good support system and know that things can come up that they had no idea was there. But a lot of people look at edge play as strictly physical. And I think that some of the emotional edge play that we do can have a lot longer lasting effects than some of the physical stuff that we do.
Yeah, exactly. So if somebody was looking to start exploring religious play, how would you recommend getting into that?
Playfully. I I wouldn't recommend that somebody do like a super intense rape scene or something with somebody who's a priest or something to delve into that. I would do the nurse maybe, or the nun maybe smacking somebody's knuckles, or telling them that they're a naughty girl or something. Just the lighter, more surface stuff, to see how your mind is going to react to even touching religion if that's part of your background. Because some people have a a whole liberating experience, being able to finally kind of throw off the bonds of your religious upbringing. And some people are so guilt ridden that they go through a whole huge process of what kind of person are they that they could even think about playing with this. Because mixing that kind of guilt with BDSM can sometimes compound all of the guilt and send people down into a spiral. So I would suggest that people start lightly and just, even if you think you're over it, even if you've been out of Catholicism or whatever since you were 10, there's a lot of hidden buttons in religion that I've noticed, and people internalize them because they've generally been brought up in that since they were children. So those things have been implanted. I kind of talk about religion like it's some kind of alien that's been planted in people. But it kind of evinces itself that way, like pop up in the weirdest random places, and you could have somebody bent over and they'll pop back into being spanked by the headmaster when they were in parochial school. Or it's interesting how the brain works, and especially things that were planted when you were very young.
Yeah, I think it's one of those areas where you don't necessarily know what's in the box you're unpacking until you start unpacking it. So it's probably best if you take a little peek first before you dump the box on the ground. And that's something that when I talked to Lee Harrington about age play, he also mentioned, was because, when you're starting out with age play, that can also have a lot of deep meaning for people and have a lot of deep background in just who they are as people. And it's very different to do a scene where you're like, I just want to, sit down and color and like watch cartoons, versus like, I want to do this scene where you wear this specific suit and this one cologne, and I want to have the room decorated in this one way. And you realize you're like actually like recreating someone's past and doing a lot of like deep emotional processing there before having ever done anything like it before. That can be really intense for sure.
Right, right. And some people want to face that, and subconsciously want to face that even, and don't know that they're recreating those themes. And so it's a lot up to the person that's more experienced in those situations to be on the lookout for those things. Like, are we going back to a specific place? I'm also a hypnotist, and so I find it really interesting that people go back into different patterns that they've had, familiar patterns that they've had when they were younger, and subconsciously try to recreate something, and a lot of times subconsciously do it in order to try to heal something that has happened. A responsibility play in those areas to be aware that people might not even know what they're doing or what they're searching for or what would happen, and to make sure that that you're willing to be available in case that person needs a follow-up a month, a year, 2 years later. If someone that I have done that kind of play with needs to connect years later and talk about something like that, I always tell people that no matter how long it's been, like this is a connection in our history. And so if it comes back, or if you need to talk about this whenever it comes up, no matter how long it's been, this is a commitment that I'm making, because this is like new history. Like, I have people that I've never met before volunteer to do a class demo, and I always make sure and talk to them before and after, and tell them that stuff might come up, and warn them that if it does, you're not weird, you're not broken, because those are a lot of the things that go through people's heads. Like, this was only an hour of my life that I randomly volunteered for. How can this affect me this much time later? And so there's so many buttons that you play with people that I think it's really important to try to be aware of them all.
And like you said, like it is actually both parties. So do you have any advice specifically for tops that are looking to engage in religious play?
Yeah, it tops need aftercare too. I tend to not look for that from the bottom. Like, my aftercare with the bottom is talking to them and making sure that they're okay before I leave. And that's because I'll worry. Like, if I don't get to talk to them after, or connect with them in some way, I will worry that I have left them, that they're not okay. And that will bother me forever. So that's my part of aftercare with the bottom. But as far as whatever I need to process, I've done a few different things, and I just try to listen to myself. I don't have a set routine, but I try to listen to myself on whatever it is I might need, and just try to be really open and gentle with myself, because there are still a couple guilt buttons that I find every once in a while. Despite all the time of having been away from the church or playing with this in my personal life, I do every once in a while stumble on something that I didn't know was there. And so it's really important to be as gentle with yourself as you would a bottom coming to you with that same problem. And so I try to talk to myself the same way I would if one of my bottoms came back and said that they needed to process something. Because a lot of times we're kinder to other people who need something than we are to ourselves.
I think religious play is such a vast area and it can be so many different things to different people. But ultimately, I think no matter how you're playing with it, you do need to remember to be kind to yourself and remember that, even if you were just the top, air quotes around, that it can be a really intense experience and it can be something where you need to, have a little bit of me time, have aftercare from someone, like you said, even if it is someone who wasn't participating in the scene, that wasn't the bottom, have to make sure that you can also make time for yourself that way. Because I think we don't do that enough, when, especially for tops. I think sometimes we tell them, we just need, you're just the top. It doesn't like you were the one who got beat up. Just, get over it, get better, and get back into it.
And I'm really, really lucky. I have an amazing support network. I work for a house of domination, and we're all super close, which I know doesn't always happen. But all of the staff is super close. We bring each other chicken soup if somebody's sick, or I'll show up for a girl party if somebody's crying or whatever. And so I'm really lucky in that I can go to other people who do what I do and say, okay, I really, really need to process something. I remember one time I had a session that was really intense, and I beat the living crap out of this guy, and he loved it. He asked for something. He was crying and thanking me all at the same time. And I had this moment where I went to the headmistress of our house, and I said, I have a serious question. She's like, okay. And I said, do you ever worry that you're a sociopath? Because I enjoyed it so much. And he was crying, bleeding. And she said, I think the very fact that you asked that question means you're not. But if you ever have doubts, we can talk through it. But sometimes you just have these doubts within yourself, and it's really incredible that I have such an amazing support network. And so props to my coworkers for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think we're just about out of time. Was there anything else you wanted to cover really briefly before we wrap up today?
Not that I can think of. Hopefully I answered all of your questions.
Yeah, no, it was great. We definitely covered a lot, I think, today. And if anybody does have any remaining questions or would like anything to be clarified, is there anywhere where they can reach out to you?
Absolutely. I am really Googleable um, by design. So I can be found, I'm really out as well. I can be found on Facebook. I can be found on FetLife under Miss Mina Hart. You can find our company website, Pavlovia Denver. You can find me, my Twitter. It's pretty much everything's under Mina Hart or Miss Mina Hart. And I am always open to questions. I also travel a lot to conferences and I'm always happy to talk to people.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing everything today. I know you're going to be at KINKFEST, and then you are teaching a class about religious play, and then you're also going to be talking about Leatherwomen, like we also discussed, and then you're also doing a class on cigar play, right?
Correct. Yeah, they wanted me to do a shortened version of my class before the cigar social. So I'll basically be talking about how to pick cigars, how you know how to cut it, what the differences are, that sort of thing. I think they only wanted me to do about 30 minutes or an hour of that. I'm excited. I love to talk about cigars and smoke them. I really love cigars and scotch. So
Well, yeah, I know it's something a lot of people are passionate about, and I also really enjoy it too. So I'll have to check it out and see what's up. But if people want to find links to anything we mentioned today or learn more about KingFest, if you're interested in going, links to all that will be down in the description box below. Thank you all so much for listening and for hanging out with us today. And if you want to, you can subscribe if you want to listen to more of these interviews. And I will see you all again very soon. Bye.